My son took my ex-husband and his new wife to meet his future in-laws, erasing me entirely. He texted Mom. "You would make this complicated," I replied. "I understand." The next morning, the three of them stormed into my house, demanding I stop ruining things. They had no idea they insulted the only person holding the money, secrets, and files that, once his fiancée saw my name on them, would shatter their perfect family performance. My name is Quinn Reyes. I am 43 years old, and I spend most of my waking hours bathed in the sterile, humming glow of fluorescent lights. I work the night shift as an operations dispatcher for the Astor Lift Air Medical Network. My world is defined by the heavy, rhythmic thud of helicopter rotors cutting through the dark, the frantic crackle of dispatch radios, and emergency calls that demand absolute, unflinching calm. We coordinate life flights for trauma victims, organ transports, and highway pileups. It is a job where seconds dictate whether someone breathes or stops breathing. It brings a specific kind of exhaustion, the sort that settles deep into the marrow of your bones and refuses to wash out. It is a blue-collar fatigue, earned through long hours of high stakes and no applause, understood only by those who actually work for a living. I drink stale coffee from a heavy thermos, watch the sun rise over the hospital helipad, and carry the weight of other people's worst days. When my 12-hour shift ends just before dawn, I drive back to a small, single-story brick house in Charlotte. I bought it 11 years ago, right after the divorce was finalized. It is not glamorous. There are no vaulted ceilings, no smart home integrated lighting, and definitely no marble countertops. But the mortgage is paid on time, the hardwood floors are swept, and the roof does not leak. The house is practical, quiet, and deeply stable. It is a sanctuary I built entirely with my own hands. That stability stands in stark, almost aggressive contrast to the life my ex-husband chose. Brett Lawson is a real estate broker who has always been far better at staging a house than actually living in one. He is a man built entirely of polished veneers, leased luxury cars, and a smile that never quite reaches his eyes. 11 years ago, he decided my quiet pragmatism was no longer suitable for his rising professional profile. He traded our messy, ordinary reality for Camille. Camille Lawson is a woman who treats life like a curated magazine spread. She survives on aesthetics, country club connections, and a terrifying ability to disguise sheer emotional coldness as high society class. If Brett is the salesman, Camille is the ultimate display window. Together, they have constructed a life that looks stunning on a holiday card, but holds absolutely no structural integrity behind the front door. Then there is our son. Everett Lawson is 27 years old. He is undeniably smart, devastatingly handsome, and flawlessly polite in public. I used to look at him and see the little boy who scraped his knees in my backyard. But over the years, he has morphed into something else entirely. Somewhere along the line, he learned his father's most dangerous trick. Everett learned how to heavily curate his existence. He learned how to keep his public face impeccably clean by quietly pushing anything unsightly, anything that did not fit the aesthetic of success, right out of the frame. For years, I told myself it was just a phase. I watched him navigate his early 20s, heavily influenced by Brett's obsession with networking, brand names, and outward appearances. I chose to believe it was a temporary infection of youth and ambition. I convinced myself that time and maturity would eventually pull my son back down to earth. I thought he would outgrow the shallow waters, realize the emptiness of his father's world, and remember the value of things that are real, solid, and unpolished. I waited patiently for the boy I raised to return. I was profoundly wrong. Everett recently got engaged to Nora Whitfield. Nora comes from a world I usually only read about in financial journals or local charity registries. Her family represents Charleston old money. They are intensely private, independently wealthy, and anchored by a century-old reputation built on corporate law, high-end philanthropy, and rigid social standards. They do not flaunt their wealth with designer logos or leased sports cars. They are the kind of people who possess quiet, absolute power because they essentially own the institutions around them. I have only met Nora a handful of times. Each encounter was a highly controlled, meticulously orchestrated dinner at restaurants where the water is poured by men in vests and the menus do not have printed prices. During these meals, Everett behaved less like a son introducing his mother to his future wife, and more like a museum curator managing a potentially volatile, slightly embarrassing exhibit. He physically positioned himself between us at the table. He controlled the flow of conversation with the precision of a traffic cop. He skillfully steered topics away from my night shifts, my modest neighborhood, or anything that hinted at the blue-collar reality of his upbringing. He presented an edited, sanitized version of his history, and I was silently expected to play along. "Mom, let me handle the talking tonight." He would text me right before I pulled up to the valet stand. Nora's family values traditional success. I just want everything to look right. I always put my phone away, smiled, and took my designated seat. I played the quiet, pleasant, vaguely background character woman he needed me to be. I swallowed the slight, washed it down with sparkling water, because I loved him and wanted him to secure his future. What the Whitfield family does not know, and what Everett goes to great, exhausting lengths to ignore, is the gritty reality of how he got to where he is. I may not have the country club membership, the summer home, or the pristine social pedigree, but I am the one who has always stood behind him, holding the safety net. While Brett was taking him to exclusive golf tournaments, buying him custom-tailored suits, and giving him empty speeches about the mindset of a winner, I was the one working forced overtime to cover the unseen gaps in his life. I chipped in tens of thousands of dollars for his university tuition when Brett's real estate commissions mysteriously fell short. 2 years ago, when Everett launched a tech startup that failed spectacularly and almost dragged him into civil court, Brett offered him a stern lecture on resilience and immediately cut off his phone plan. Everett called me at 3 a.m, his voice shaking, the polished veneer completely shattered. I did not give him a lecture. I gave him a cashier's check. I emptied my emergency savings and quietly paid off the looming corporate debt to keep his credit score intact and his legal record perfectly clean. For the past 3 years, I have been working extra shifts, pulling every ounce of holiday pay and overtime I could physically manage, quietly building a massive wedding fund. I have been preparing a financial gift large enough to wipe out his remaining hidden debts and secure a massive down payment for the historic townhouse he and Nora have been touring. I wanted to give him a clean slate. I wanted to change the trajectory of his life forever. But as the wedding planning intensified over the last few months, a cold, hard truth began to settle over my quiet brick house. The distance between Everett and me was not accidental. It was architectural. I looked at the photos he posted online, the stories he told his friends, the way he navigated his new, elevated social circle in Charleston. I was never mentioned. My financial contributions and late-night rescues were absorbed silently, treated as an automatic entitlement rather than a bleeding sacrifice. He did not just drift away from me as he grew older. He actively and systematically cropped me out of his life's portrait. The deepest tragedy of my life did not happen in a single, explosive moment of betrayal. It happened slowly, with polite smiles, managed dinners, and unreturned phone calls. I am not simply an absent figure in my son's life. I am the woman who was deliberately erased from his story, written out of the script entirely, so that the leading man could look perfectly flawless, standing next to his wealthy father and his elegant stepmother. I am the invisible, bruised foundation holding up their glittering, hollow tower, and they all just assume I will stay buried in the dirt, keeping my mouth shut, exactly where they think I belong. It was late afternoon on a bitter, wind-swept Thursday in late autumn. The air outside my kitchen window held that brittle, sharp quality that always signals the dying of the year. I had just finished my 4th consecutive night shift, and my body still hummed with the phantom adrenaline of emergency dispatch. My head ached with the lingering echoes of frantic radio calls and the rhythmic, heavy chopping of helicopter blades. Yet, inside my house, The silence was absolute. I stood at the kitchen sink, letting scalding water run over my stiff fingers, watching a cascade of dry, brown leaves scrape violently against the frosted glass of the back door. My phone vibrated against the Formica counter. It was a short, sharp buzz that demanded attention. I reached for it, wiping my wet hand on my jeans. The screen displayed a new message from Everett. Heading down to Charleston this weekend. The text read, "Taking the family down to meet Nora's people before we make the engagement official. Big dinner on Saturday evening." I leaned against the counter. A warm, genuine flutter of anticipation briefly pushed back the heavy exhaustion sitting in my chest. This was the milestone we had been quietly moving toward for months, the formal merging of the two families. I picked up the phone and typed back with the easy, practical rhythm of a mother naturally assuming her place in the protocol of her child's life. "That is wonderful news," I wrote. "What do I need to prepare? What time are we leaving?" I pressed send, set the device face up on the counter, and turned back to the sink to scrub the bitter remnants of stale coffee out of my heavy thermos. I mentally calculated if I needed to buy a new dress, perhaps something in a muted navy or charcoal, something respectful enough for the Whitfield estate but practical enough to endure a long car ride. 1 minute passed, then 3 minutes, then 7 minutes. In the digital age. A delayed response from a 27-year-old man who practically lives attached to his screen is never an accident of timing. It is an intentional pause. It is the heavy hesitation of drafting, deleting, and redrafting a difficult sentence. I stood completely still, staring at the blank, black glass of the phone. The warmth that had bloomed in my chest began to rapidly cool, hardening into a familiar, suffocating knot. I recognized this specific, heavy silence. I had felt it many times before. It was the calculated silence that always preceded Everett attempting to manage me, to neatly package me away so I would not disturb his polished surroundings. When the screen finally illuminated again, the gray text bubble appeared, vanished, and reappeared twice before finally solidifying into a block of text. "Actually, it is just going to be Dad and Camille coming with me," he wrote. "Nora's side is quite traditional, and they are hosting at the main family estate. Dad understands those rooms better. It just makes sense for the dynamic they are expecting." I did not drop the phone. I did not gasp for air. I did not even blink. I just looked at the glowing letters long enough to feel an old, dull, unspoken truth rapidly changing its shape, crystallizing into something incredibly sharp and dangerous. Dad understands those rooms better. It was a masterpiece of polite devastation. It was Everett deploying the refined, corporate vocabulary he had absorbed from Brett to say something profoundly ugly. He was telling me that I was too unpolished, too working class, too distinctly ordinary to be seated at a mahogany dining table inside a Charleston mansion. I did not understand those rooms. All I knew was how to silently exhaust my own reserves to finance the bespoke suit he intended to wear among them. I remained motionless in the stillness of my kitchen. The late afternoon sunlight began to fade, casting long, gray, stretched shadows across the hardwood floor. I took a slow breath in, and the air inside my own home suddenly felt terribly thin. I tapped the screen and typed 3 words. "What about me?" It was not a desperate plea. It was a calculated test. I needed to see exactly how far my son was willing to go. I needed to see how boldly he was willing to trace the heavy, black line he had been carefully sketching around my existence for the last 5 years. The reply arrived instantly, as if he had already rehearsed his justification for the execution. "Mom, you would make this complicated. I need this weekend to look right." There was no sudden, blinding explosion of maternal rage. There were no hot tears welling in my eyes or spilling down my cheeks. I did not feel the urge to scream or hurl my phone against the solid brick wall of the kitchen. What I experienced was entirely different. It was a perfectly clean, freezing, clinical pain. It was the absolute agony of a highly skilled surgeon's scalpel slicing cleanly through healthy, beating tissue. It was the terrifying realization that this deep cut, had been thoroughly calculated, precisely measured, and ultimately deemed strictly necessary for his social survival. You would make this complicated. My mere existence, my undeniable presence as the biological woman who gave birth to him, was a complication to be mitigated. My calloused hands, my sensible, scuffed shoes, the undeniable fact that I drove a 7-year-old sedan and budgeted my groceries. These fundamental truths of my life would ruin his carefully curated aesthetic. I would not look right standing next to the crystal wine glasses, the imported silver cutlery, and the silent wealth of the Whitfield family. I stood rooted to that spot for a very long time. I opened the keyboard and typed out dozens of different, furious responses. I typed furiously about the $50,000 I had quietly, desperately wired to a corporate escrow account to save him from his failed tech venture. I typed paragraphs about the thousands of hours of grueling night shift overtime I had logged so he could wear the correct, expensive brands throughout high school. I typed about the massive, life-altering wedding fund currently sitting in a high-yield savings account exclusively under my name, waiting to be transferred to him to secure his future. I typed it all out, watching the angry words fill the screen, and then, slowly, deliberately, I pressed the backspace key and deleted every single letter. I erased the justified anger. I erased the undeniable history of my sacrifices. I erased the desperate defense of my own dignity. Instead, I sent the only 2 words that left me retaining total, undeniable emotional control. I understand. I switched the phone to silent mode, placed it face down on the cold counter, and walked slowly into my bedroom. I lay down flat on the mattress in the darkening room, staring blankly at the ceiling. I felt the deep, rhythmic, heavy thud of my own heart against my ribs, plotting the steady pulse of a woman who had just been pronounced socially dead by her own flesh and blood. The actual, fatal death sentence, however, did not arrive until later that evening. It was well past 9 o'clock. The neighborhood was completely dark and entirely silent, save for the occasional, distant hum of a passing car. I was sitting rigidly in the living room, a cup of untouched chamomile tea going ice cold on the wooden side table. I picked up my phone out of pure, masochistic habit and opened the Instagram application. There it was, pinned at the very top of my digital feed. Everett had posted a photograph. They were standing on the grand, sweeping front porch of a spectacular, historic Charleston home. The scene was perfectly framed by massive, pristine white columns and elegantly trailing Spanish moss. Brett looked impeccably tailored in a sharp navy blazer, exuding that false, practiced warmth he had perfected over decades of real estate deals. Camille was wearing a flawless silk dress that draped perfectly over her frame, her hair styled in effortless, fiercely expensive waves. Everett stood squarely between them, looking handsome, confident, and completely at ease. They looked exactly like the glossy cover of a high-end brochure advertising generational wealth and perfect, unbroken family harmony. But it was not the striking image itself that finalized the brutal fracture in my soul. It was the short line of text typed carefully underneath it. Grateful to introduce my parents to Nora's family before the next step. My parents. He did not write my father and my stepmother. He did not write my dad and Camille. He wrote my parents. I stared at those 2 specific words until the illuminated letters blurred into meaningless, jagged black lines. The sharp pain I had felt in the afternoon was no longer a clean cut. It had transformed into a slow, dark, spreading poison in my bloodstream. He had not just excluded me from a weekend trip for the sake of social convenience. He had actively, aggressively replaced me. He had taken the sacred title I had earned with over 2 decades of quiet, backbreaking, relentless sacrifice, and handed it freely to a woman who treated motherhood like a convenient social accessory. He had fundamentally rewritten his own history, and in this new, perfectly polished, highly marketable narrative, I simply did not exist. I pressed the side button and locked the screen, plunging the room back into shadows. The kitchen was dark. The house was freezing cold. I did not shed a single tear. I simply sat there in the heavy silence and realized, with absolute clarity, that the boy I had spent my entire adult life protecting was completely gone. And the polished stranger who had replaced him was about to find out exactly what happens when you arrogantly discard the only person secretly holding up the entire foundation of your stage. It was barely 8 in the morning. The winter sun was just beginning to cast a weak, pale light across the frost-covered grass of my front lawn. I stood in my small kitchen, wearing my faded gray sweatpants and an oversized thermal shirt, holding a warm ceramic mug of black coffee. I was enjoying the rare, absolute silence of my house before the demands of the day could find me. Then, the distinct, aggressive crunch of tires on gravel shattered the morning quiet. I looked through the horizontal blinds of the kitchen window. 2 vehicles had just pulled into my narrow driveway, aggressively blocking my 7-year-old sedan. The first was Brett's leased, midnight blue German luxury car, gleaming as if it had just rolled off the showroom floor. Right behind it was Camille's pristine, oversized white sport utility vehicle. The doors opened in unison. Brett, Camille, and Everett stepped out into the freezing air. They were dressed impeccably, wrapped in tailored wool coats, cashmere scarves, and the invisible, suffocating armor of absolute entitlement. They marched up my concrete walkway with the synchronized, purposeful strides of a committee arriving to manage a crisis. They did not look like family members dropping by for a visit. They looked like people who fully believed they were the sole voices of reason, arriving to pacify a deeply irrational woman. I did not move to unlock the door. I simply stood by the counter and waited. Everett pushed the front door open, stepping into my living room without a single knock. Brett and Camille filed in closely behind him, immediately filling my modest, quiet space with the overwhelming sense of expensive cedar cologne and floral perfume. No one offered a good morning. No one asked how my 12-hour night shift had been. Everett crossed the room and stopped a few feet away from me. His handsome face was pulled tight with a mixture of exhaustion and profound irritation. "Mom, why are you acting like this?" he demanded, his voice sharp and accusatory. "Why are you overreacting just because of one important weekend?" I looked at him over the rim of my coffee mug. Overreacting. I had sent a 2-word text message agreeing to his terms. I had not called him screaming. I had not threatened to crash the dinner. I had done exactly what they wanted me to do, which was to disappear. Yet, my quiet compliance was somehow still a problem. They needed my submission, but they also desperately needed my validation to absolve their own guilt. Brett stepped forward, taking his stance next to our son. He unbuttoned his wool coat, adopting the deeply patronizing, falsely soothing tone he used when trying to convince a skeptical client to sign a bad contract. "Quinn, let us just be adults about this situation," Brett said, gesturing with his perfectly manicured hands. "You have to understand the environment Everett is stepping into. Families like the Whitfields operate in a completely different social stratosphere. They are highly traditional. They are very sensitive to messy family dynamics. Stories about bitter divorces, or conversations about manual labor. It brings a very heavy, uncomfortable energy into the room. We are just trying to keep the atmosphere light and appropriate for the occasion." Camille shifted her weight, allowing her expensive leather handbag to slide elegantly down her forearm. She offered me a smile that was entirely composed of bright white teeth and zero genuine warmth. "It is really about curating a clean, simple, and elegant first impression, Quinn," Camille chimed in, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Nora needs to introduce a cohesive front to her parents. You should honestly be thrilled that Everett is trying so hard to build a secure future for himself. You should be happy for his upward mobility instead of making this about your own feelings." I did not raise my voice. I did not throw my hot coffee in their perfectly moisturized faces. The burning rage I expected to feel was entirely absent. In its place was a chilling, absolute clarity. I saw the 3 of them not as my family, but as a group of actors desperately trying to maintain a stage play. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, letting the bitter liquid ground me in reality. I am not making a scene, I stated calmly, keeping my eyes locked on Everett. I am not angry that you are going to Charleston, but I do want you to answer one question for me. Everett. And I want you to look me in the eye when you answer it. Everett crossed his arms over his chest, immediately defensive. What question? When you sat down with Nora and her family, and they inevitably asked about your mother. I began, my voice steady and perfectly leveled. What exact words did you use to explain who I am? What did you tell them to justify why I am completely excluded from this integration of families? Everett broke eye contact immediately. He looked down at the hardwood floor, shifting his weight uncomfortably. I just told them you live here in Charlotte, he muttered, evading the trap. I told them you have your own life. Do not insult my intelligence, I replied, my tone dropping a fraction of an octave, hardening into steel. You did not just tell them I have my own life. You had to give them a reason why my presence would be a detriment. Tell me the truth. Everett, what did you say? He glanced at Brett, silently begging his father to intervene and throw him a lifeline. Brett opened his mouth to speak, but I held up a single finger, silencing him instantly. I kept my gaze pinned entirely on my son. Everett swallowed hard. His polished, confident demeanor began to crack under the heavy silence of the room. I told them that we were not that close, he finally stammered, his voice lacking all its previous arrogance. I told them you were always working when I was growing up. I told them you were not really present for most of my adult life. The words hung in the air, toxic and heavy. That single, cowardly sentence completely obliterated the final, lingering shred of my maternal defense. I understood in that exact moment that this was not a simple matter of social etiquette or wedding logistics. This was a calculated, deliberate campaign to revise history. He had actively portrayed me as an absentee mother. He had taken the thousands of night shifts I worked to keep food on his table, the holidays I spent dispatching helicopters so he could have a roof over his head, and twisted that sacrifice into a story of parental neglect. He used my exhaustion to buy his own innocence in the eyes of his future in-laws. I set my ceramic mug down on the kitchen counter. The heavy base of the cup hit the laminate surface with a sharp, definitive crack. I see, I said. My voice was dangerously quiet. You told them I was not present. Mom, try to understand my position, Everett pleaded, taking a half step forward, sensing the sudden, dangerous shift in the atmosphere. Oh, I understand your position perfectly. I interrupted him. I stood up completely straight, squaring my shoulders against the three of them. And since I have not been a present figure in your adult life, it makes absolutely perfect sense that I should no longer be a present figure in your adult finances. The room went instantly, terrifyingly quiet. The kind of quiet that precedes a massive structural collapse. I looked directly at Brett, then at Camille, and finally back to Everett. At exactly 6 o'clock this morning, right after my shift ended, I logged into my private investment portal. I authorized a complete liquidation of the dedicated mutual fund I opened 6 years ago. I withdrew the entire balance of $275,000. The money I spent the last decade quietly bleeding myself dry to save for your wedding expenses and the down payment on your new historic townhouse. I watched the color drain completely out of Everett's face. He turned the shade of dirty snow. Brett's confident, patronizing posture shattered instantly. His mouth fell open in genuine shock. Camille's manicured hand flew to her chest, her eyes widening in sheer panic. The funds are currently clearing into a secure, locked account under my name only, I continued, feeling a dark, cold wave of power wash over me. Since I am nothing more than a heavy energy and a bad aesthetic, I am completely certain that the three of you will have absolutely no problem covering the catering deposits, the venue fees, and the real estate closing costs on your own. For the first time in their lives, the brilliant, flawless actors realized the stage was entirely rigged. They realized the woman they had so confidently classified as a working-class embarrassment was actually the only person holding the master keys to the financial vault they had been secretly banking their entire future on. Have a wonderful drive to Charleston, I said. The silence in my kitchen was absolute, heavy, and incredibly dangerous. I watched Everett closely, studying the microscopic shifts in his expression. What I saw did not break my heart. It chilled my blood. His face did not register the profound sorrow of a son who had just deeply wounded his mother. Instead, his features contorted into the raw, unadulterated panic of a man who suddenly realized he was standing on a trapdoor that had just swung wide open. His eyes darted frantically around the room, as if the missing hundreds of thousands of dollars were physically hiding behind my modest furniture. He was not mourning a fractured family dynamic. He was performing rapid, catastrophic mental arithmetic. He knew the non-refundable catering deposit was due in exactly 5 days. He knew the historic townhouse required a massive 20% down payment to even initiate the escrow process. He was drowning in real time, and the life raft he had arrogantly assumed would always be there had just been violently yanked away. Brett immediately stepped forward, attempting to physically block my line of sight to Everett. He puffed out his chest, desperately trying to reclaim the authority that had evaporated from the room seconds prior. He decided to deploy moral blackmail, a tactic he had used countless times during our marriage. "You are acting entirely out of spite," Brett declared, his voice thick with rehearsed righteous indignation. He pointed an accusatory finger at me. "You are completely ready to sabotage the entire future of your own kin merely because your pride was mildly stung over an insignificant dinner arrangement. You are maliciously exploiting his economic security. This is purely about your ego. It is incredibly selfish, and frankly, it is pathetic." I did not shrink back. I did not cross my arms defensively. I stood completely still and held his hostile gaze without blinking. "Ego is when a person desperately wants to look good for an audience," I replied, my voice echoing off the kitchen walls with cold precision. "What you are looking at right now is dignity." Brett's jaw tightened. He had no counter-argument for the absolute truth. Sensing the aggressive approach was failing spectacularly, Camille immediately pivoted her strategy. She smoothly stepped past Brett, adopting the soft, pacifying tone of a seasoned diplomat trying to de-escalate a hostage situation. She offered me a look of deep, completely manufactured empathy. "Let us all just take a collective deep breath," Camille murmured, her voice dripping with artificial conciliation. "Please, let us not turn a simple miscommunication into a massive generational rupture. We all want the exact same thing here. We want Everett to succeed. We just need to navigate these new social waters carefully. Erasing your contribution was never the intention. It was merely a matter of framing the narrative correctly for a very specific audience." I stared at her flawless makeup. She was actually trying to convince me that systematically deleting a mother from her child's life was nothing more than a minor public relations oversight. Before I could respond to Camille's astonishing display of manipulation, Everett's composure completely shattered. The polished, heavily curated gentleman evaporated, leaving behind a terrified, financially overextended boy. "Mom, you cannot do this," Everett blurted out, his voice cracking with genuine desperation. "The escrow company needs the initial earnest money transferred by Tuesday morning. The wedding planner requires another $40,000 by the end of the month. I cannot cover those margins, and Dad already promised Arthur Whitfield that he was personally taking care of the newlyweds' housing gap. If that wire transfer does not go through, the entire real estate deal collapses, and the Whitfields will know we lied." The kitchen fell dead silent once again. Everett immediately clamped his mouth shut, his eyes widening in horror as he realized exactly what he had just confessed. Brett shot his son a look of pure, murderous rage. I stood frozen, letting the magnitude of Everett's verbal slip wash over me. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together, forming a horrifyingly clear picture. Take care of the housing gap. Brett was not simply traveling to Charleston to play the role of the handsome, sophisticated patriarch. He was actively using my blood, my sweat, and my decades of exhausting night shifts to build his own financial leverage. He had sat in rooms wrapped in mahogany and leather, looked the billionaire Whitfield patriarch directly in the eye, and promised to fund the young couple's real estate acquisition. Brett was taking total, uncontested credit for the massive financial gift I had silently built. He was using my life savings as his personal entry fee to secure a seat at the high society table. That was the real reason I had to be completely erased. If I showed up in Charleston, if the Whitfields saw the tired, working-class mother who actually held the purse strings, the math would no longer make sense. Brett's carefully constructed illusion of immense, liquid wealth would shatter instantly. I was not just a bad aesthetic, I was a walking, breathing liability to a massive financial con. "Get out," I said. My voice was hardly louder than a whisper, but it carried the absolute finality of a judge dropping a gavel. "We are not leaving until we resolve this," Brett tried to argue, puffing his chest out again. "You will leave my house right now," I commanded, stepping toward the front door and pulling it wide open, letting the freezing morning air rush into the living room. "Or I will call the police and have you formally trespassed. The three of you can spend the drive to Charleston figuring out how to explain the sudden housing gap to Arthur Whitfield." They realized the negotiation was entirely over. The performance had failed. They filed out of my house in tense, furious silence. Brett refused to look at me. Camille kept her eyes fixed on the pavement. Everett paused at the threshold, opening his mouth as if to offer one final plea. But the absolute coldness in my eyes stopped him. He stepped out, and I slammed the heavy wooden door shut, engaging the deadbolt with a sharp, metallic click. I walked slowly back to the living room and sat down on the edge of the sofa. The house was empty again. I waited for the inevitable, crushing wave of maternal guilt to wash over me. I waited for the tears, for the desperate urge to pick up the phone and wire the money just to ensure my child was safe and happy. But as the minutes ticked by, turning into a full hour, the guilt never arrived. For the first time in 27 years, I felt absolutely no remorse for saying no to my son. I felt no obligation to set myself on fire to keep him warm. That total absence of guilt terrified me in a completely new way. It was the stark, undeniable proof of just how thoroughly and for how long I had been used. I had been conditioned to view my own exploitation as a sacred duty. Breaking that conditioning felt like taking a breath of oxygen after living underwater for a decade. At 7:30 that evening, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Mara Reyes standing on my porch. Mara is my cousin, a fiercely intelligent, cynical investigative reporter for the largest local newspaper in the county. She has short, dark hair, sharp eyes, and a terrifying ability to see straight through any polite fiction. She walked inside, carrying a brown paper bag smelling heavily of cheap takeout food and holding a bottle of dark red wine. She did not ask how my day was. She walked straight to the kitchen, retrieved 2 glasses, poured the wine, and sat down at the small dining table. I sat across from her and, over the course of an hour, recounted every single detail of the morning's confrontation. I told her about the text message, the withdrawal of the funds, and Everett's disastrous admission about the housing gap. Mara listened in total silence, chewing her food methodically, her eyes narrowing as she processed the information. When I finally finished, she took a slow sip of her wine and set the glass down. She did not offer me warm sympathy or maternal platitudes. She offered me a surgical diagnosis. "You have been looking at this entirely wrong," Mara said, her voice dropping into the flat, serious cadence she used when untangling municipal corruption cases. "You thought this was about class. You thought this was about Everett being embarrassed by your sensible shoes and your night shift schedule. Is it not?" I asked, feeling a dull ache in my temples. "No," Mara stated firmly, leaning across the table and locking her eyes onto mine. "You are not cut out of the picture because you are an embarrassment. You are cut out because you are a massive structural liability. You know the actual math. You have the bank statements. You hold the receipts for every single time Brett failed, and you had to quietly bail their son out of a disaster." She tapped her index finger against the wooden table for emphasis. "This is not a story about an ungrateful son wanting a pretty family photo," Mara continued. her words sharp and illuminating. This is a story about a coordinated fraud. Brett is leveraging that marriage to gain access to the Whitfield family's corporate network. He needs to look like an equal player to get into their financial ecosystem. The entire fake structure they have built depends entirely on one single factor. It depends on your absolute, unquestioning silence. I stared at the dark red liquid in my glass. The pain of a son's rejection was suddenly eclipsed by the chilling reality of a calculated conspiracy. Mara had just opened the door to a much deeper, far more dangerous conflict. They did not just want me hidden, they needed me erased to protect their grift. And by cutting the financial cord that morning, I had not just ruined a wedding, I had actively pulled the primary load-bearing pillar out from under their entire fraudulent existence. 2 days later, my phone rang. It was early afternoon on a Tuesday. I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at a stack of unopened mail, still trying to process the absolute silence that had settled over my life since the confrontation. The caller identification displayed an unknown number from Charleston. A cold prickle of anticipation washed over the back of my neck. I answered on the third ring. "Hello? Is this Quinn Reyes?" the voice asked. It was a woman's voice, smooth, composed, and carrying the distinct, measured cadence of generational wealth. It was a voice accustomed to giving instructions without ever needing to raise its volume. "This is Quinn," I replied. "Good afternoon. My name is Eleanor Whitfield. I am Nora's aunt, and I also serve as the managing director for our family's legal and financial trusts." I sat up perfectly straight. I did not interrupt her. I let the silence hang, waiting for her to reveal the angle of her approach. "I am calling you directly because I find myself in a rather perplexing situation," Eleanor continued, her tone remaining impeccably polite, almost conversational. "Our family is very thorough when it comes to the integration of new members. As part of the standard preparations for the marriage, I have been reviewing the preliminary financial disclosures and the drafts for the marital trust. I am seeing several details that simply do not align with the history Everett has shared with us." "What kind of details?" I asked carefully. "Well, for starters," Eleanor said, the rustle of heavy paper audible through the receiver, "I am looking at a preliminary note regarding a very substantial wedding gift and real estate deposit. The originating account for this proposed transfer lists you as the sole account holder. This is highly contradictory, considering Everett has made it quite clear to my brother and me that you are, for all intents and purposes, entirely uninvolved in his adult life." My grip on the phone tightened. Everett had been so thorough in his verbal erasure of me, but he had been utterly careless with the paper trail. He had submitted the financial planner's projections based entirely on my promised money, without realizing that my name was legally anchored to the originating accounts. Eleanor did not sound angry. She sounded like an auditor who had just found a glaring mathematical error and was quietly pulling the thread to see what would unravel. "I prefer direct communication, Quinn," Eleanor stated softly. "So I am going to ask you a few very specific questions. I would appreciate the simple truth. Did you pay for Everett's final year at his private university?" "Yes," I answered evenly. "I transferred the full tuition amount directly to the bursar's office in late August of that year." "I see," Eleanor noted. "And 2 years ago, when his technology venture faced a civil dispute regarding intellectual property, who provided the capital for the out-of-court settlement?" "I did," I replied. "I liquidated a portion of my retirement savings to cover the legal fees and the settlement demand so he would not have a public judgment on his record." "And this wedding fund?" Eleanor pressed, her voice lowering slightly, acquiring the sharp edge of a prosecutor closing in on a witness. "The money allocated for the townhouse down payment. Is Brett Lawson contributing to this fund?" "No," I said, my voice rock steady. "Every single cent in that account was earned by me, working night shifts as a medical dispatcher for the last 6 years." A long, heavy breath escaped Eleanor over the phone. It was the sound of a woman realizing that a very elaborate, very expensive illusion had just been successfully dismantled. I did not offer any emotional exposition. I did not complain about my broken heart or my ungrateful son. I knew instinctively that a woman like Eleanor Whitfield would not respect tears. She would only respect facts. "Eleanor," I said, breaking the brief pause, "if Nora's family intends to judge me, and if you intend to judge whether or not my son is fit to marry into your family, at least let them judge the real version of the story." "That is exactly what I intend to do," Eleanor replied firmly. "I am inviting you to come to Charleston tomorrow, not to the family estate. I want you to meet me at the Whitfield family law offices in the historic district. No social pleasantries, no formal dinners. Just a closed-door meeting to establish the absolute truth before this marriage goes a single step further. I will be there at noon," I told her. When I ended the call, I immediately dialed Mara. She arrived at my house less than 45 minutes later, carrying a reinforced cardboard banker's box and a fierce, determined glint in her dark eyes. For the next 5 hours, we turned my small living room into a war room. We pulled every single file folder from my metal cabinet. We organized the paper trail of my entire maternal existence. We printed out the bank statements showing the exact dates and amounts of the university tuition wires. We found the signed promissory notes and the cashier's check receipts from the startup disaster. We printed out the time-stamped emails where Everett begged me for financial rescue, his tone desperate and pleading, a stark contrast to the confident, independent young man he portrayed in Charleston. But the most devastating piece of evidence surfaced right around midnight. Mara was digging through a forwarded email chain that Brett had accidentally sent me a month prior. A chain he had meant to forward to his own accountant. It contained a draft of a financial portfolio he had submitted to Arthur Whitfield. Mara read the document, her face turning pale, and then pushed the paper across the coffee table toward me. "Look at page 4, Mara instructed, her voice tight with disbelief. I scanned the spreadsheet. There, listed under a section labeled Lawson Family Liquid Assets, was the exact, highly specific dollar amount of the wedding fund I had built, $275,000. Brett had not just taken credit for the gift in passing conversation. He had formally integrated my life savings into his own financial disclosure. He was using my money to artificially inflate his net worth, presenting himself to the Whitfield family as a man of immense, liquid means. He was using this fraudulent financial profile to secure a massive commercial real estate partnership with Nora's father. It was a complete, documented fraud. He had stolen my financial identity to buy his way into their empire. And the only way to get away with it was to ensure I was never allowed in the same room as the Whitfields to correct the record. I stared at the spreadsheet until the numbers burned themselves into my retinas. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. Brett and Everett had not simply pushed me out of a photograph. They had buried me alive and stolen my wallet to pay for the funeral. I slowly stacked the bank statements, the emails, and the fraudulent financial disclosure into a neat, perfect pile. I opened my weathered leather briefcase and placed the documents inside. I zipped the compartment shut with a sharp, decisive motion. I was no longer a mother traveling to meet her son's future in-laws. I was not going to a family gathering to beg for a seat at the table. As I placed my hand on the cool leather handle of the briefcase, I fully understood the reality of the situation. I was stepping into an informal tribunal, armed with the undeniable, irrefutable truth. I was about to put their entire carefully constructed universe on trial, and I had exactly the evidence required to secure a conviction. The drive from Charlotte to Charleston took just over 3 hours. I did not listen to the radio. I drove in absolute silence, letting the steady hum of the tires against the asphalt anchor my mind. The Whitfield family law offices occupied a meticulously restored 19th century building in the heart of the historic district. There were no flashy signs, only a modest brass plaque next to heavy, dark wood doors. It was a place designed to handle generational wealth with absolute discretion. When I was escorted into the primary conference room, the visual contrast between the two sides of the table was almost violent. Brett, Camille, and Everett sat rigidly on one side of a massive mahogany table. They were dressed as though they were about to sit for an oil painting destined for a country club lobby. Brett wore a flawless charcoal suit that radiated artificial authority. Camille was draped in an understated but brutally expensive cashmere dress, her posture perfectly straight. Everett wore a sharp navy blazer, his hair styled immaculately. They looked like a unified, flawless front of high society elegance. I walked in carrying the weariness of a woman who had worked 12-hour night shifts for the better part of 2 decades. I wore sensible dark slacks, a simple, unbranded blouse, and comfortable flats. My hair was pulled back into a practical knot. I carried my weathered leather briefcase. I did not look like old money, and I certainly did not look like a woman attempting to impress anyone. I looked exactly like what I was, a working-class mother holding the absolute truth. At the head of the table sat Eleanor Whitfield. She possessed the sharp, entirely unreadable demeanor of a seasoned litigator. To her right sat Nora. It was the first time I had seen my son's fiancée outside of a heavily orchestrated restaurant environment. Nora looked directly at me as I took the empty leather chair opposite Everett. Her eyes held a complex, turbulent mixture of emotions. There was clear defensiveness, a lingering trace of the false narrative she had been fed. But beneath it all, there was a sharp, undeniable curiosity. She was studying me, trying to reconcile the bitter, absent woman she had been told about with the quiet, entirely composed person sitting across from her. I did not offer any warm greetings. I did not engage in small talk. I placed my leather briefcase on the polished mahogany surface, unfastened the brass buckles, and opened it. The room was so quiet that the sound of the zipper echoed off the wood-paneled walls. "I am not going to waste your time with a long speech," I said, my voice low, steady, and entirely devoid of theatrics. I was told there were discrepancies regarding my involvement in my son's life. I brought the timeline. I pulled the first stack of papers from the case and placed it squarely in the center of the table. "This is the bank wire transfer receipt for his final year of undergraduate tuition," I stated, tapping the top page. "It is dated 7 years ago. The amount is $48,000. Transferred directly from my personal checking account to the university bursar." I did not wait for a reaction. I pulled out the next file and laid it neatly next to the first. "This is the legal correspondence and the subsequent cashier's check receipt from 3 years ago," I continued, my tone entirely clinical. "This documents the out-of-court settlement for the failed technology startup. I liquidated $35,000 from my retirement fund to ensure Everett did not face a public civil judgment." I pulled out the third folder. "These are the transaction logs for his rent, groceries, and car insurance during his 2 years of transitional employment. And finally, the account statements proving I am the sole owner of the mutual fund intended for the real estate deposit and wedding expenses." I rested my hands on the table and looked directly at Eleanor. "Every single piece of paper is authenticated. You can run them through any forensic accountant you employ." Brett slammed his hand down on the table, attempting to shatter the devastating rhythm I had established. His face was flushed with panic. "This is entirely out of line," Brett announced, his voice booming with forced indignation. He looked at Eleanor, trying to regain his footing. "Eleanor, you must understand. Money does not define the core of parenting. Financial transactions do not equate to emotional presence. We have always provided the emotional and structural guidance Everett needed to navigate his world." Eleanor did not flinch. She simply turned her head and pinned Brett with a look of absolute, freezing disdain. "Mr. Lawson," Eleanor replied, her voice dropping into a register that commanded total obedience. "Please do not insult my intelligence by attempting to pivot to philosophy. This is a legal office. We are not discussing the abstract concepts of parenting. We are discussing the very tangible concept of fraud. We are discussing who sits at this table and tells the truth, and who sits at this table and lies." Brett closed his mouth instantly. The air in the room grew incredibly thin. Nora leaned forward. She ignored Brett entirely and fixed her gaze directly on Everett. The defensive posture she had held when I walked in was completely gone, replaced by a deep, hollow betrayal. "You looked me in the eye," Nora said to Everett, her voice trembling slightly before hardening into steel. "You told me your mother was practically a ghost. You told me she was barely in your life. What exactly are these documents?" "Everett." Everett swallowed hard. His carefully constructed poise was disintegrating in real time. He looked at the stack of papers as if they were venomous snakes. He tried to deploy the same evasive tactics he had used in my kitchen. But under the blinding lights of the Whitfield Law Office, his words sounded weak and deeply pathetic. "Nora, it is complicated," Everett stammered, his eyes darting toward the door. "Yes, she helps out financially sometimes, but she does not understand my world. She does not understand the social obligations or the circles we operate in. We just live entirely different lives." He had meant it as a defense, but he had unknowingly handed them the final piece of the puzzle. He had spoken the quiet part out loud. He had just admitted, in front of the entire room, that he viewed his mother not as a human being, but as an ATM machine. He viewed me as an unlimited financial resource that was completely devoid of humanity and undeserving of basic respect. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice or beg for validation. I looked at the boy I had given everything to, and I felt nothing but a profound, empty pity. "He wants a mother who is silent when he needs love," I said quietly, addressing the room but looking only at Everett. "And he wants a mother who is completely invisible when he needs an image." The entire room seemed to physically sink. Camille stared blindly at her hands. Brett looked nauseous. Everett closed his eyes, finally realizing there was no public relations spin that could possibly save him from the absolute ugliness of his own character. Eleanor remained completely still, her brilliant mind turning over the wreckage on the table. She looked at the documents, then at Everett, and finally, she fixed a long, calculating stare on Brett. I could see the gears shifting behind her eyes. She was a woman who understood motives. She recognized that a son's vanity was one thing, but Brett's profound confidence in orchestrating this elaborate erasure pointed to something far more sinister. Why was Brett so incredibly arrogant? Why was he so certain he could write me out of existence before presenting his family to an empire that vetted everyone so aggressively? Eleanor knew there was still a massive, dark void in the center of this story. A void connected to the commercial real estate promises Brett had made to her brother. The meeting did not end with screaming. It did not end with a dramatic, table-flipping confrontation. Eleanor simply closed her leather notebook, thanked me for my profound clarity, and stated that the Whitfield family required time to deliberate internally. As I packed my documents back into my weathered briefcase, the silence in the room felt entirely different than when I had arrived. A massive tectonic shift had occurred. When I looked up, Nora was watching me. The confusion and the conditioned disdain were completely gone from her expression. She was no longer looking at the pathetic, abandoned, working-class mother she had been warned about, for the first time since the engagement began. Nora was looking at me with absolute, unadulterated respect. She recognized that amidst a room full of impeccably dressed actors desperately clinging to a crumbling script, I was the only person who had never once pretended to be anything other than exactly who I was. The fallout from the meeting in Charleston did not arrive with the loud, dramatic explosion my ex-husband had likely anticipated. The Whitfield family belonged to an echelon of wealth that did not throw tantrums or engage in public shouting matches. Old money moves with terrifying, silent efficiency. They did not immediately cancel the wedding or issue any formal declarations of war. Instead, over the course of the next 48 hours, they quietly and systematically froze every single financial commitment tied to the upcoming union. The massive deposit for the grand reception venue was placed on an indefinite administrative hold. The joint escrow account intended for the historic townhouse, which Arthur Whitfield had personally guaranteed, was abruptly locked pending a thorough legal review. The intricate machinery of their perfect, high society wedding simply stopped turning. Everett began to spiral almost immediately, for his entire adult life. My son had navigated the world using perfectly curated aesthetics and smooth, ambitious platitudes. He had never been required to explain the actual, gritty mechanics of his existence. Now, suddenly stripped of his unlimited funding and his fabricated origin story, he was trapped. He was being forced to explain a life he had previously only decorated with pretty, empty words, and he was failing spectacularly. The desperate phone calls began on Thursday evening. Camille was the first to break the silence. When I answered the phone, her voice was a toxic, vibrating mixture of forced condescension and absolute venom. "You are a deeply bitter, small woman, Quinn," Camille hissed through the receiver, entirely dropping her elegant diplomat persona. "You really could not just let him be happy, could you? You could not handle the undeniable fact that your son outgrew your limited, depressing little world. So you decided to poison Nora and her family out of pure, spiteful jealousy. You walked into that office and deliberately humiliated him simply because your feelings were hurt." "I did not humiliate him, Camille," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly flat and devoid of emotion. "I merely handed over the receipts. If the truth is humiliating, that is a reflection of the life you built, not the papers I printed." I disconnected the call before she could scream another word. Brett tried a completely different angle the following morning. He did not call to negotiate. He left a highly aggressive, blustering voicemail designed to intimidate me into submission. "You are treading on incredibly dangerous ground, Quinn," Brett's recorded voice boomed through my phone speaker. "You are deliberately interfering with high-level corporate relationships. I already have my attorneys reviewing your little stunt in Charleston. You are causing measurable financial damage to my professional brand. If you do not contact Eleanor immediately to walk back your exaggerated claims and apologize for your emotional outburst, you are going to face severe legal consequences." I deleted the voicemail with a single tap of my finger. I felt no fear whatsoever. I knew exactly what that message was. It was not a genuine legal threat. It was the loud, chaotic, desperate noise of a cornered animal realizing the trap was rapidly closing around his neck. While Brett and Camille were busy wasting their energy threatening me, Nora was taking a completely different approach. I would learn later from Eleanor that Nora did not cry, and she did not demand immediate answers from Everett. She simply went to work. Nora was far too intelligent to rely solely on the documents I had provided. She began quietly and systematically auditing her own relationship. She independently verified every single detail Everett had ever told her about his past. She looked into the appraisal of her custom diamond engagement ring. Everett had claimed he saved his own money for over a year to purchase it. Nora quietly checked the jeweler's purchase date. It perfectly matched the date of a massive cash withdrawal from my mutual fund. A withdrawal I had authorized to help him secure a special purchase. She looked into his short, highly expensive stint in a Master of Business Administration program. Brett had proudly claimed he covered the tuition as a graduation gift. Nora cross-referenced this with the exact fractional payments highlighted in my bank records. She checked the security deposit on Everett's first luxury apartment in Charlotte. With every detail she investigated, a devastating, undeniable pattern emerged. Whenever a major financial hurdle was cleared, whenever a crisis was averted, Brett had confidently stood at the front of the stage to take the credit. Everett had smiled, nodded, and remained entirely silent. And I, the woman they claimed was barely present, was the one actually standing in the shadows, footing the bill and absorbing the impact. By Friday evening, the sheer scale of the deception began to reveal itself fully. Mara arrived at my house unannounced, carrying a thick manila envelope and wearing an expression of grim satisfaction. She spread printed architectural blueprints, corporate filings, and land deeds across my kitchen counter as an investigative reporter. Mara knew exactly how to follow a paper trail through the dark corners of the county registry. "Brett is completely drowning," Mara explained, tracing a line across a complex financial flowchart she had drawn. "He is heavily over-leveraged on a massive, highly speculative coastal real estate development project just outside of Hilton Head. He secured the land rights, but he does not have a fraction of the liquid capital required to break ground. and the banks are absolutely refusing to extend his credit lines. I stared at the blueprints, the pieces of the puzzle rapidly locking into place. He needs a guarantor, I whispered. He needs much more than that, Mara corrected, tapping the documents. He needs institutional weight. He needs a name that the banks will blindly trust. He needs Arthur Whitfield. Brett has been using Everett's relationship not just to look good, but as a soft bridge to pull the Whitfield family into this risky commercial venture. He was going to use his new status as family to bypass their usual corporate vetting process. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The coordinated effort to erase me from the picture was never just about avoiding the social embarrassment of a working-class mother with sensible shoes and a night shift schedule. It was a calculated, necessary business strategy. They had to systematically replace the one person who knew their actual financial reality with a polished, wealthy facade. They needed to present a flawless front to secure a multi-million-dollar grift. I was not just a stain on their aesthetic. I was the primary obstacle to a massive corporate fraud. After Mara left, I could not sleep. The house felt too quiet, the air too thick with the ghosts of the sacrifices I had made for a son who was actively participating in my erasure. I sat down at my small desk in the corner of the living room and opened my laptop. I wanted to sever every remaining digital tie I had to Everett's financial accounts. As I scrolled through years of archived correspondence to ensure I had not missed any lingering joint liabilities, I typed Everett's name into the search bar. Deep in the results, buried beneath hundreds of mundane messages about phone bills and car repairs, I found a forwarded email thread from 3 years ago. It was a message Everett had originally sent to Brett, discussing a weekend networking event they were planning to attend together. I clicked on the message, my eyes scanning the casual, corporate jargon they always used with each other. But the final sentence, sitting at the very bottom of the screen, made my blood turn entirely to ice. Make sure Mom does not plan on visiting that weekend. Everett had written, if she shows up, the whole working-class history thing gets harder to sell to these investors. I sat in the glow of the monitor, reading those words over and over again. Gets harder to sell. It was the ultimate, blackest truth. He was not just a naive boy being manipulated by his father. He was an active, willing participant. He viewed his own life, and by extension, my existence, as nothing more than a marketing campaign. Any lingering sliver of doubt, any desperate maternal hope that my son was just a confused victim of Brett's ambition, died right there in the glow of the computer screen. That single sentence transformed every remaining suspicion into absolute, irreversible certainty. They had built a beautiful, towering house of cards, and I was finally ready to burn it straight to the ground. Mara slammed her hand down on my kitchen counter, her dark eyes flashing with a predatory, journalistic fire. It was Saturday morning, and she had just finished reading the printed copy of the email I had discovered the night before. The email where my own son coldly calculated that my working-class history would be too difficult to sell to his future investors. "We leak this," Mara demanded, her voice vibrating with absolute certainty. "We do not even need to publish it in the paper. I will personally courier this single sheet of paper directly to Eleanor Whitfield, and I will carbon copy the senior loan officers at every bank Brett is trying to court for his coastal development. We detonate his entire fraudulent empire right this second." I took a slow sip of my black coffee, letting the bitter heat ground me. I looked at the printed email lying on the laminate counter. It represented the ultimate, undeniable betrayal. Yet I felt an eerie, profound sense of calm. The frantic, bleeding wound of a rejected mother had completely cauterized overnight. In its place was a landscape of pure ice. "No," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying enough weight to make Mara pause. "We are not sending anything." Mara stared at me as if I had suddenly lost my mind. "Quinn, this is the smoking gun. This proves Everett is not just a brainwashed kid following his father's lead. He is the co-architect of your erasure. You have the power to absolutely annihilate them right now. And if I do it now, I become the aggressor. I explained, maintaining strict eye contact with my cousin. If I launch a preemptive strike, Brett will immediately spin it. He will tell the Whitfields that I am a vindictive, unstable ex-wife trying to ruin a beautiful union out of pure jealousy. He will use my anger to validate his lie that I am a toxic presence. I'm not going to give him the luxury of playing the victim. I want them to walk confidently into the room, entirely under their own power. And I want the people they are trying to con to see the rot for themselves. Mara slowly lowered her hand, a grudging respect washing over her features. She understood the strategy. True, devastating ruin does not come from a sudden ambush. It comes from allowing a liar to confidently step onto a stage they do not realize has been rigged to collapse. My strategic patience was validated the very next afternoon. My phone vibrated with a private, unlisted number. When I answered, there was no legal preamble, no administrative assistant patching the call through. It was just a quiet, incredibly tired voice. "Quinn, it is Nora." She did not sound like the polished, guarded heiress I had faced in the mahogany conference room. She sounded like a young woman standing alone in a very dark room, questioning the foundation of her entire reality. "Hello, Nora," I replied softly, stepping out onto my back porch to escape the suffocating silence of my empty house. "I am calling you without my aunt or my father knowing," Nora confessed, her breath hitching slightly. "I have spent the last 2 days verifying everything you put on that table. The tuition, the legal settlement, the ring. It is all true. Every single word of it is true." She paused, and I could hear the immense, crushing weight of her disillusionment through the receiver. "I just need to ask you one question," Nora continued, her voice dropping into a register of raw, desperate human curiosity. "It is not a legal question. I just need to understand. Why, after everything he did to you, after the way he actively pushed you into the shadows and let his father take the credit for your sacrifices, why were you still planning to give him that massive wedding gift? Why were you still going to hand over $250,000 to a boy who treated you like a ghost?" I closed my eyes and leaned against the wooden railing of my porch. It was the hardest question anyone had ever asked me, because the answer required me to expose the most pathetic, enduring flaw of my own heart. "Because being a mother is a very heavy, very stubborn habit," I answered, the absolute truth stripping away any remaining pride I held. "When you spend 27 years organizing your entire existence around protecting a child, you do not simply turn it off when they disappoint you. You become conditioned to prepare for their future, to build a safe house for them, even when they actively lock you out of it. I was going to give him that money because a mother's instinct to save her son often outlives her son's undeniable failure to deserve her grace." Total silence followed my words. I could hear Nora's ragged breathing on the other end of the line. The impact of my answer was seismic. Everett had spent months carefully painting me as a bitter, hostile, and deeply controlling woman. He had warned Nora that my energy was dark and suffocating. Yet, here I was, quietly admitting that my greatest flaw was an excess of sacrificial, unrequited love. The stark, undeniable contrast between his vicious lies and my quiet reality completely shattered whatever lingering emotional defense Nora was holding onto for him. "Thank you for your honesty, Quinn," Nora whispered, her voice hardening with sudden, absolute clarity. "I will see you on Thursday." I did not know what Thursday meant until the following morning. An impeccably worded, formal email arrived from Eleanor Whitfield's office. It was directed to Brett, Camille, Everett, and myself. It announced an official evening dinner at the primary Whitfield estate in Charleston. The stated agenda was to frankly discuss the recent discrepancies, align the mutual interests of the two families, and finalize the direction for both the impending nuptials and the associated commercial real estate ventures. I knew exactly how Brett would interpret this invitation. He would read the polite, corporate phrasing and convince himself that he had survived the storm. He would assume the Whitfield family was too deeply invested, too concerned with social decorum, and too interested in the potential profits of his coastal development to pull the plug over a minor family squabble. He would view this dinner as his absolute final opportunity to salvage the entire operation. He would undoubtedly force Camille to wear her most elegant pearls, demand Everett put on his most expensive tailored suit, and drill them relentlessly on maintaining their flawless, high society facade. He would believe that if they just looked the part and smiled confidently enough, they could charm their way out of the financial grave they had dug. But my invitation was different. A few hours after Eleanor's formal summons arrived, I received a separate, brief message directly from Nora. "Please come. I need you there." For the first time in this entire grueling ordeal, I was not a woman stubbornly forcing her way into a room where she was unwanted. I was not a reluctant, embarrassing secret being hidden from view. I was being actively summoned by the bride herself. I was required. When Thursday afternoon arrived, I dressed exactly as I always did, sensible, practical, and devoid of any pretense. I walked into my home office and picked up the weathered leather briefcase. Inside, nestled beneath the heavy stacks of authenticated bank transfers and legal settlement receipts, I placed the printed copy of Everett's email. I slid the single sheet of paper into a clear protective sleeve. This was no longer just about defending my financial integrity against Brett's corporate fraud. It was about addressing the deeply personal, calculated cruelty of my own child. The email was the definitive proof that Everett was not a helpless pawn caught in his father's manipulative gravity. He was an adult who had looked at the woman who bled for him, calculated her market value, and actively chosen to sell her out because my working-class reality was inconvenient for his branding. I walked out to my car, tossing the briefcase onto the passenger seat. As I pulled out of my driveway and merged onto the highway heading south toward Charleston, a profound, chilling clarity settled over my mind. The upcoming evening was not going to be a negotiation. It was not going to be a therapy session to heal a fractured family dynamic. I was driving toward a meticulously staged execution. The final act was no longer about proving who was right or wrong behind closed doors. It was about the exact, surgical moment when every single beautiful, expensive mask would be violently ripped away, exposing the ugly, rotting truth underneath, right in front of the exact audience they had sacrificed my soul to impress. The Whitfield family estate sat on a sprawling, immaculate stretch of private waterfront property. By 8 o'clock in the evening, the grand dining room was bathed in the warm, golden glow of a massive crystal chandelier. The heavy mahogany table was draped in pristine white linen, set perfectly with sterling silver cutlery, delicate porcelain plates, and tall, deeply faceted wine glasses. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the dark, calm water of the harbor reflected the ambient light. It was a breathtaking, cinematic backdrop. It was the absolute perfect setting for a historic merging of two powerful families. Or, as it was about to become, the venue for an incredibly polite, ruthlessly efficient social execution. I arrived precisely on time. In the grand foyer, before we were seated, I quietly handed Nora the clear plastic sleeve containing the printed email. She did not read it in front of me. She simply folded it, slipped it beneath the edge of her dinner napkin, and offered me a single, resolute nod. When we moved into the dining room, the visual dynamics were immediately striking. Brett entered with his chest puffed out, radiating a heavily practiced, artificial confidence. He wore a brand-new tailored black tuxedo, clearly hoping the sheer weight of his formal wear would shield him from any lingering scrutiny. Camille floated in beside him, her posture rigid but her smile firmly fixed in place, looking every bit the elegant society wife who had never experienced a single moment of genuine panic. Everett followed them, wearing a perfectly fitted dark charcoal suit. However, unlike his father, Everett could not hide his terror. His shoulders were tense, his jaw was locked, and his eyes frantically darted around the room, specifically avoiding any line of sight that included me. I took my assigned seat near the center of the table. I wore a simple, unadorned navy dress and my comfortable black flats. I did not attempt to match their opulence. I did not wear jewelry. I sat with my hands folded quietly in my lap. Yet, My mere presence fundamentally altered the gravitational axis of the entire room, for the very first time in Everett's carefully curated life. The woman he had meticulously edited out of his story was sitting directly in the middle of it. The meal began. Course after course of incredibly rich, beautifully plated food was served by silent, efficient staff. Throughout the soup and the delicate seafood appetizers, Arthur Whitfield, the patriarch of the family, held court at the head of the table. What made the atmosphere so intensely suffocating was the absolute courtesy of it all. No one raised their voice, no one threw an accusation. In fact, Arthur and Eleanor barely mentioned the wedding at all. Instead, they steered the conversation toward highly abstract, philosophical concepts. Arthur spoke eloquently about the foundational importance of personal honor. Eleanor discussed the binding weight of a man's word, the heavy responsibilities of managing generational wealth, and, most chillingly, how a true family is measured entirely by how it treats its most vulnerable members when they are no longer deemed useful. Every single polite sentence they delivered landed like a heavy, velvet-covered brick on Brett's shoulders. The air grew incredibly thin. The clinking of silver against porcelain sounded like the ticking of a bomb. Brett began to sweat. He realized the philosophical conversation was a beautifully disguised interrogation of his own character. Desperate to change the trajectory of the evening and save his collapsing facade, he waited for a brief lull in the conversation and forcefully pivoted the topic. "I completely agree with your sentiments on building a lasting legacy, Arthur," Brett announced, lifting his glass of expensive red wine with a forced, booming laugh. "And that is exactly why I am so incredibly excited about the synergies between our families regarding the coastal development project. Focusing on future growth, on creating tangible, profitable assets together, is the best way to honor our shared values. We have a monumental opportunity to move forward and leave the past behind us." He was begging them to look at the money instead of the morality. He was trying to buy his way out of the grave. Eleanor placed her heavy silver fork down on her plate. She reached beneath the table and produced a secondary, thick manila dossier. She did not open it aggressively. She set it next to her crystal water glass with the calm precision of a surgeon laying out a scalpel. "Speaking of moving forward with tangible assets, Brett," Eleanor said, her voice smooth and entirely devoid of warmth, "our analysts spent the afternoon reviewing the preliminary ledgers for your coastal development. We found some fascinating discrepancies regarding your debt leverage. We also found a series of internal emails between you and your primary lenders. It appears you explicitly used the impending marriage of our children as a guarantee of institutional backing, effectively pledging Whitfield capital that was never offered to you, in order to artificially inflate the credibility of your incredibly risky venture." Brett's wineglass stopped halfway to his mouth. The dark red liquid trembled violently. Everett let out a slow, shaky breath. He slumped slightly in his chair. In his naive, desperate mind, he clearly believed that this financial revelation was the final blow. He thought the worst was over. He assumed that because Brett was taking the direct hit for corporate fraud, his own personal betrayals might safely remain buried under the rubble of his father's ruined business deal. He was entirely wrong. Nora slowly reached over and pulled the clear plastic sleeve from beneath her white linen napkin. She did not look at Brett. She did not look at Eleanor. She kept her eyes locked entirely on the man she was supposed to marry. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic lapping of the harbor water against the stone bulkhead outside the grand windows. "We talk a lot about the future, Everett," Nora said quietly, her voice echoing clearly in the vast dining room. "But I think we need to address exactly how you view the people who built your past." She slid the printed email out of the sleeve. She did not read the entire chain. She only read the single, fatal sentence, her diction perfect, her tone absolutely merciless. "Make sure Mom does not plan on visiting that weekend. If she shows up, the whole working-class history thing gets harder to sell." The dining room instantly froze into a block of solid ice. The immaculate, expensive mask Camille had worn for 11 years finally shattered. Her mouth fell open, and she stared at the table as if it had suddenly caught fire. Brett lost his voice completely. The blustering, confident salesman evaporated, leaving behind a pale, rapidly aging man who suddenly realized his son was just as fundamentally broken as he was. But it was Everett's reaction that commanded the room. He physically recoiled, as if Nora had reached across the white tablecloth and struck him across the face. His eyes darted wildly toward his father, then toward Camille, silently begging them to interject, to spin the narrative, to save him just as they always had. But they remained entirely mute, for the very first time in his life. The handsome, polished young man realized there was absolutely no one left to explain away his cruelty. His charm was completely useless. His tailored suit felt like a straitjacket. Nora placed the piece of paper squarely in the center of the table, directly next to the flickering flame of a tall white candle. She turned her head and looked directly at me. It was a look of profound, solemn acknowledgement. She recognized the immense weight of the truth I had carried into this house. Then, she slowly turned her gaze back to Everett. Everyone sitting at the heavy mahogany table understood in that exact, suspended second that the performance was permanently over. The final act was not going to be saved by Brett's phantom money, by Camille's forced politeness, or by any of Everett's soft, practiced apologies. We were standing right at the edge of the absolute void, and there was nothing left to do but fall. Nora did not scream. She did not burst into the messy, chaotic tears of a heartbroken bride whose entire future had just been violently derailed. Instead, she placed both of her hands flat on the pristine white linen tablecloth and slowly pushed her heavy mahogany chair back. She stood up. In the grand golden-lit dining room of the Whitfield estate, her posture was completely rigid, her expression forged from absolute steel. "Do you want to know the true tragedy of this entire situation, Everett?" Nora asked, her voice ringing out with crystal clarity, cutting through the suffocating silence of the room. "You actually convinced yourself that this was all about aesthetics. You thought my family cared so deeply about social pedigrees and country club memberships that you had to bury a living, breathing woman, just to secure your place at this table. But the issue here is not that your mother works night shifts. The issue is not her sensible clothes, her practical car, or her lack of a trust fund. The issue is that you and your father systematically erased a real, loving mother solely to sell us a prettier, more marketable fiction." Everett opened his mouth, perhaps attempting to offer one of his perfectly rehearsed, soft-spoken apologies. But Nora raised a single hand, silencing him instantly. "There will be no wedding," Nora declared. It was a cold, precise, and entirely non-negotiable statement. "There will be no compromises, no private counseling sessions, and absolutely no second chances. I am calling off the engagement right here, right now." The finality of her words struck the room like a physical shockwave. Before Everett could even process the absolute destruction of his personal life, Eleanor Whitfield leaned forward, clasping her hands securely over the thick manila dossier. "And to be absolutely clear on the corporate front," Eleanor stated, her tone shifting seamlessly from familial disappointment to ruthless legal authority, "the Whitfield family is entirely withdrawing from your coastal development project. Brett, any preliminary agreements, any letters of intent, and any financial commitments based on the presumed trust between our two families are completely terminated as of 8 o'clock this evening. Our attorneys will be sending the formal dissolution paperwork to your primary office tomorrow morning. You will not receive a single cent of our capital." Brett's face contorted into an ugly, desperate mask of sheer panic and fury. His entire fraudulent empire was disintegrating right before his eyes, unable to accept his own catastrophic failure. He instinctively sought a familiar scapegoat. He turned his venomous, bloodshot glare directly toward me. "Are you happy now, Quinn?" Brett spat, his voice trembling with humiliated rage. "You came all the way down here to ruin your own son's life. You poisoned this well. You manipulated these people just to punish us because you could not stand being left behind in your miserable little life. "Stop talking, Brett," Nora cut in, her voice slicing through the heavy air like a sharpened blade. She looked at him with a level of absolute disgust that no amount of money could ever wash away. "Do not dare try to project your own deceit onto her. The only person in this room, the only person I have interacted with over the last 2 months who has not actively tried to manipulate me, is his mother." Brett's jaw snapped shut. The utter humiliation of being reprimanded by a woman half his age, a woman whose wealth and influence he had desperately tried to steal, completely broke him. He shrank back into his chair, entirely defeated. Everett slowly turned his head to look at me. The arrogant, polished young man who had demanded my absence only days prior was entirely gone. In his place sat a terrified, drowning boy. His eyes were wide and vulnerable, silently begging me to intervene. For 27 years, whenever the world grew too heavy, whenever a debt came due or a failure threatened to ruin his perfect trajectory, he had turned to me. He expected me to step in, to absorb the massive blow, to write the cashier's check, and to shield him from the harsh consequences of his own actions. I looked back at my son. I did not raise my voice. I did not hurl toxic insults or revel in a loud, dramatic vengeance. The burning anger had completely faded away, leaving only a profound, incredibly clean truth in its wake. "I have saved you for so long that you mistook my sacrifice for an obligation," I told him, my voice steady, quiet, and resolute. "You thought my protection was just a permanent fixture of your life, a resource you could use and discard whenever it suited your public image. But I am done being your safety net. From tonight on, you are going to have to meet yourself without me standing in the middle." Those words severed the final, invisible cord between us. Everett flinched physically, as if the reality of my statement had struck him across the face. The silence that followed was definitive and heavy. Camille was the first to break, unable to endure the suffocating atmosphere of total exposure any longer. She abruptly pushed her chair back. Her face was entirely drained of color, her perfect facade crumbling into dust. She practically fled toward the grand foyer without uttering a single word. Brett pushed himself up heavily from the table. His broad shoulders slumped in utter defeat, and followed his wife in absolute, crushing disgrace. Everett remained frozen in his chair for several long seconds. He looked around the beautiful dining room, stripped entirely of his vocabulary. For the very first time in his existence, his refined manners, his country club connections, and his carefully curated image could not buy him a single inch of an exit strategy. He finally stood up, avoiding my eyes completely, and walked out into the dark hallway alone. I remained seated, suddenly realizing that my hands, which had been tightly clenched for days, were completely relaxed. The massive, invisible weight I had carried for nearly 3 decades had simply vanished into the coastal air. Eleanor and Arthur quietly excused themselves, offering me deeply respectful nods as they retreated deeper into the massive estate. Giving Nora and me the privacy of the dining room, Nora stood at the head of the long table. She took a deep, grounding breath, the immense tension slowly leaving her shoulders. She walked over to where I was sitting and stood gently beside my chair. "Thank you, Quinn," Nora said softly. I looked up at her, slightly surprised by the genuine warmth in her tone. "For what? For having the courage to come here," she replied, offering a small, exhausted but genuine smile. "For telling me the absolute truth when it would have been so much easier to stay hidden away. And most of all, thank you for not turning your pain into something ugly. You showed more grace tonight than anyone else in this room." Her quiet gratitude washed over me like cool, healing water. In that brief, honest exchange, Nora handed me the exact validation and respect that my own son had stubbornly denied me for years. I gathered my small clutch purse and walked out of the Whitfield estate. I did not look back at the towering white columns or the glowing crystal chandeliers. I stepped out into the cool, crisp evening air, walked to my reliable 7-year-old sedan, and started the engine. as I drove away from Charleston and merged onto the dark, northbound highway. I rolled the driver's side window down just a fraction. The rush of the night wind filled the cabin, carrying the faint scent of salt and pine. My heart ached for the son I had lost. But beneath that dull ache was an overwhelming, brilliant sensation of lightness. I realized then that this journey was never really about revenge. It was about profound liberation. I finally understood that the most beautiful, enduring victories in life do not come with loud celebrations or the chaotic destruction of your enemies. They happen in the quiet, peaceful moments when you realize you no longer need anyone else's permission to simply exist in your own story. Thank you all so much for listening to this story to the very end. Please let me know where you are listening from in the comments below, so we can connect and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Olivia Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me further by hitting the hype button so that the message in this video can be heard by many more people.